with Coker is a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape.
Welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Coker. My name is Mark Reiboldt, and today, jumping right into the topic, we are talking about a trend that I don't know is new, but is seen a lot of growth recently. And we've been doing a lot of work around it, so we thought it'd be a good idea for us to talk about a little bit more. We're talking about MSOs, Management Services Organizations, also commonly referred to as BSOs, Business Services Organizations. And joining us today, we have Max Reiboldt, who is President and CEO of Coker Group, and Andy Sobczyk, who is a manager here in our physician services department. And both Max, Andy, and others are doing more and more work around MSO development, MSO strategy, and in particular, MSO transactions. And so, again, we thought it'd be a good idea to provide a little bit more information. Before we dive into the discussion, I just want to briefly remind everyone this episode, as well as all of our episodes, can be found via our website. You can find those directly at coffeewithcoker.com or cokergroup.com as well. And you can follow us on social media and subscribe to the podcast so you get notifications on not only when new podcasts come out, but also all of our content that goes out weekly. And you can stay up to speed on all the different things that Coker is covering in the healthcare industry. So we thank you guys for listening. And with that, we want to jump right into the discussion with Andy and Max. We're going to talk about what are MSOs and what's entailed. Before I say that, I do want to let everybody know we have a very detailed presentation on this topic, and it goes into a lot of granular details. And we're not going to be able to dive into all of those today, but I do want to mention for folks, if we're covering something from a high level, we have a lot of additional information. If people are interested, they can absolutely reach out to us. Again, they can reach out to us via the website or on social media, and we're happy to share the more detailed slides. Covering this from a little bit of a higher level, Max and Andy, before we talk about what MSOs are, I think it may be helpful for the audience to understand, why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about this now? Why is this a growing trend? Why is this relevant for our audience?
Sure, I'll jump in first, and Andy, by all means, add some points as well. But MSOs, and again, we're morphing them into sometimes calling them BSOs, are not new and have been in existence for many, many years. I think the relevance to them more so now is in the context of much transactional activity between physicians, private equity, hospitals, other consortiums that have been formed where the MSO concept has a lot more applicability in the context of these transactions. So as we're looking at and completing many such transactions of this nature, they really fit the format and the structure very well. In some cases, they're almost a legal requirement in some states to have an MSO to be the actual entity that affiliates with private equity firms. In other states where maybe that's not an absolute requirement, it still makes good business sense. And so many groups, as they're planning for their future, are looking at forming or spinning off a management services organization, maybe even calling it a BSO, to accommodate the potential, whether or not they do a transaction that particular time or not. So the relevancy of them has gained in popularity in recent years. So Andy, I'll let you add some comments to that and maybe some flavor as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think this, kind of increasing trend of seeing more and more MSOs is directly linked to the transactions with, private equity or even health systems going after practices. I think the pandemic, the results of the pandemic from last year may have even exacerbated this a little further as we saw transactions increase by the end of last year. Private practices are looking for partners more frequently these days, and there are some that are a little more entrepreneurial and will take the approach of forming their own MSOs, with the idea of creating new value for the practice that may not just come from the fee for service revenue. May allow them to build a larger platform if they're say a surgical practice and they want to add more surgical practices in the region or grow their footprint. It's another way for physicians to continue to remain more independent. And even in some of these private equity transactions, we're seeing practices go that route because they get a stake in the new entity that is formed as a result of this transaction. They remain independent. The physicians do, but then the practice contracts with the MSO that's formed, and the physicians may get a cut or some equity stake in that new company that comes out of the MSO. And so it's something that provides value for both, the acquiring party and then also the one being acquired. And we're finding that just as those transactions and that activity continues to pick up, kind of where it left off before the pandemic, we're just seeing clients and other folks within our network be more and more interested. Also interested in doing new things with MSOs. Traditionally, you would see them just provide practice management services, just kind of the basic operations management, HR. Some have their own kind of revenue cycle or billing office type functions. We're seeing some that are popping up and want to be, a little more creative or entrepreneurial, looking into real estate investments or even developing, clinically integrated networks and other, I guess, service lines or business lines that can add to the value of the overall company. So I guess to sum all that up, we're seeing a lot of flexibility in this, and there are opportunities both for independent physicians and for firms or health systems that are looking to acquire.
Yeah. So in a world of oftentimes being squeezed on revenue, whether it's from reimbursement or trying to optimize quote unquote operations and processes, this could be a really innovative opportunity. Again, not new, but we'll talk about some of the how they're doing that. But I do think before we get too far down that road, let's just define a little bit more what we're talking about, the what, if you will, the MSOs, BSOs, and is there a distinction between those two, or are they essentially redundant?
I think there's a lot of similarities, Mark, between the two. I think the distinguishing factor is a BSO really is more of a second, maybe third generation entity that would expand beyond just the basic management services that you would find typically in a MSO. So, for example, a BSO can take on more innovative initiatives, real estate investments, other investments, obviously within appropriate economic boundary and regulatory boundaries. It could be a clinically integrated organization. Obviously, it could include some information systems. Sometimes we use the term even not to confuse things even more, but ISO or information systems organization. And then, of course, these days, the newer, more cutting edge things, business intelligence, artificial intelligence, analytics, all those could be a part of more of an expanded BSO, which gives the players, the potential partners, even more opportunities for affiliation and partnering. So that's really more the concept behind the BSO, whereas MSOs are your, at least in my way of thinking, have always been more of the traditional billing and accounting and some personnel management support functions to practice.
And they're owned by typically by the partners of the group, correct? Or how is that typically broken down?
Yeah, until such time as they're sold to private equity or some semblance thereof. Yes, they would be formative uh, in the practice and provide hopefully opportunities for the partners of the practice to enjoy some element of outside investment and hopefully return.
What else about the ownership and governance? Is it typically going to be at least, let's just say it's just a group directed MSO, and it's perhaps the end goal is to sell to private equity or joint venture and sell an equity stake. But until then, is this something that the group forms? Is it typically just one group? Is it something that can be extended beyond just an initial practice, or what have you all typically seen there?
So I think, Mark, we've seen it a couple of different ways. I mean, I think some of the clients we're currently working with, it's one group that has the MSO, and that MSO serves that group. They're looking to expand. So the idea, and where the value really comes in, and kind of pursuing that entity is in the kind of economies of scale, and being able to provide those, management or business services to multiple practices, so that everybody within that kind of network can benefit from the improved efficiencies. Also, can take out some of the administrative burden that those physicians, maybe didn't like as much when they were just solely responsible for everything in their practice. So I think we would say that it can be any number of ways, starting with one practice, one MSO, and then growing to more of a network type approach where you have multiple ones joining into the MSO.
Yeah, I know we've done multiple transactions, and going back a number of years, even where we actually work with the hospital. Well, actually, we work both sides, but in these cases, there was a health system or hospital that wanted to purchase it all or an equity stake in an MSO to serve as the kind of management function for their own employed physician and contracted physician network. Is that still a pretty popular trend, or where's that going versus the private equity route?
I think it can be, but in all honesty, most major health systems don't really look to practices for that sort of function. They've more or less built their own entity that does that. Their physician enterprise, as we often call it, it certainly could be. And depending on the level of size and sophistication of an affiliation, for example, if it is a large, usually multi-specialty group that already has an MSO, and the hospital, for whatever reason, has not created such an entity, it certainly could. But truth is, we don't see too much of that out there because, again, hospitals have been employing practices now for many years, most of them 2 or 3 decades, some form or fashion. So they've kind of got their own infrastructure in place.
Yeah. So as we kind of continue to talk about the what and define what we're talking about, I want to take it into how are they doing some of this stuff, but maybe go into a little bit more detail on if whether it's let's just call it first generation newly launched MSO by a group, all the way down to something that has been around, they've expanded it, they built up infrastructure, maybe they're providing services to multiple groups, and ultimately kind of evolving towards that, what you described as the BSO type model, where they're expanding their services and being a little bit more innovative. What services are we really talking about? How does that work out? And as we think about that whole evolution of growth for them?
You're referring to more of the BSO services?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should cover the MSO piece because there may be a lot of groups out there that want to do this, and they got to start somewhere. They may not be able to do something as broad as what maybe a larger BSO does. So I think we should talk about the MSO piece, but I think that will also help extend the discussion into what it may look like in the future when they do achieve more scale and growth.
Andy, why don't you go ahead and discuss that, if you will?
Yeah, and feel free to chime in, Max, if I'm missing anything here. But I would say, just to put it simply, it's anything that isn't clinical. In terms of where services typically start with an MSO. It's all the non-clinical administrative functions that you would see in a practice. So, from check in, check out to scheduling, billing is one we've mentioned several times. HR, pretty much anything that doesn't touch the clinical area is what we would typically see in those initial MSOs, even accounting and finance as well.
Yeah. What about, the a little bit more of the, again, that BSO function, as we think about even post transaction, perhaps with private equity, as they continue to grow, and I mean that's going to be the goal of the private equity, right? To acquire a platform and further develop it, grow it through add-on acquisitions and scale, and then some sort of second transaction. So what are they looking to grow as far as a BSO in terms of the services and functions?
Yeah, it's probably all the things that Andy pointed out for sure. Plus, you get a lot more innovation as such and potentially involved within a great deal more flexibility. And one of the things that at least many private equity firms tout, and I'm not saying they don't do. In fact, I'll say they do is provide capital for growth and expansion. So there can be a larger platform upon which this NewCo, this BSO, as we call it, forms and then functions that ultimately creates more value for the partners. So it could be any number of things I noted a few minutes ago: business intelligence, functions, analytics, obviously payer contracting, again, within appropriate legal parameters, where value-based reimbursement platforms can be formed. And the BSO would be, in fact, that platform for doing so, doing the value-based reimbursement. Group purchasing is another, real estate ventures and joint ventures, IT and information systems that again are akin to the artificial and business intelligence products. Research and clinical trials would be another one that might be a platform within a BSO. We even have some physicians, particularly surgeons, who are very innovative and have design some particular surgical supply or surgical equipment that they've received patents on that would be included as a part of the overall investment and the platform as such. So device inventions, things like that, monitoring services, remote patient monitoring systems, chronic care management programs. There's really the list just goes on and on. Telehealth processes that could all be couched or could reside within this BSO. And obviously, the practice is still the engine that, or the fuel that runs the engine as such, this bigger entity. If you don't have the physicians, none of this works or is functional, at least very little of it would be. And so all these things are still in play, but they really create a huge opportunity for value for the physicians. And you might say, well, why couldn't you do this all within the practice? Well, you could, but it's more easily sometimes marketable when you separate this out like this and then look for a transaction with a strategic or really just a operational partner or both. And so we're really merely kind of putting things in the right place for the potential opportunity to enhance that value through growth and ultimately a transaction. So that's often why they're done that way.
And you alluded earlier to sometimes you actually kind of have to do this if you want to go about a transaction, particularly with a private equity sponsor. Mm-hmm. Maybe just talk about that briefly, if you don't mind, why that would be the case.
Yeah, certain states have requirements for acquiring professional entities and operating them by physicians, non-professionals as such in that field. And so I'm certainly not going to pretend to go into or be an expert on legal matters within each state. And then there's other things like CON regulations that might get in the way. There's even antitrust that could be in play. So all these things are ways to try to help conform to both state and federal requirements in such areas. And so whether it's form over function or function over form, I'm not sure, but it's more of a pragmatic approach. And again, I think many physicians like the idea of retaining their professional entity to some extent for themselves, because there is certain, I guess you would say, value in maintaining your professional practice as somewhat separate and independent from all these other things that you do and the partnering with outside non-physician investors. So those are typically the reasons I found to why these things are created and spun off somewhat separately.
Yeah. That's helpful. And obviously, our first recommendation is when it comes to that question, consult with legal counsel, engage good quality healthcare attorneys that understand the regulatory landscape and how to navigate those different requirements. But I know some of the work we often find ourselves advising MSOs, BSOs on, in addition to the development of the organization, as well as navigating and assisting through the transaction process. What about though, just, are there kind of some standard best practices, guidelines that we recommend that may be helpful for folks if they're considering developing an MSO, or maybe they're already neck deep in it and they're thinking about expanding it towards a transaction? What would you, how would you kind of frame that for folks in that position?
I think a lot of it is kind of best practices that you would see just in overall, management of a physician enterprise. But we would recommend that physicians continue to be involved in decision making, and by nature, the way that these transactions are set up, they kind of have to be. Especially in those corporate practice of medicine states, where the transaction will require an MSO be formed so that the physicians can have some level of control. But we would recommend that those that do participate or join into an entity like this would remain involved in decision making in some form. In addition, sharing of data across practices, those that if there's multiple ones being served by an MSO, we would recommend as much clinical kind of integration or integration of systems as possible. The same way you would want to see, within a health system acquiring practices, you would want to be on the same platforms as much as you possibly can, just to, achieve efficiencies and be able to share information. In addition, we would want the entity to have a pretty strong plan for how they would go about approaching, payers and managed care organizations to, achieve value with respect to their platform. Can they, offer a level of service or a level of quality that would, give them access to contracts that they otherwise wouldn't have, or do they have the scale that would give them access to rates that they previously didn't have? That I think is becoming more and more of a big factor in practices deciding to either create their own MSOs or join others, is to basically have that leverage. It's really hard to go at it alone with respect to payers these days. And so I think we would, want to say that the strategy and the infrastructure that you have around negotiating contracts or creating business cases for new contracts would be very strong.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that real quickly that that last point's incredibly important, Andy made, and relevant, but it also extends on to the value-based, risk-based contracting. There is truly, and legally, of course, structured strength in numbers, when legally structured, and that's where, as we've already said, good attorneys, healthcare attorneys come in, but essentially to really be able to create this critical mass of providers that can move a group, MSO, BSO, into not just fee for service, but value based reimbursement and be able to take on certain risks. The payers, the commercial payers, and of course, Medicare and the government already are commercial payers are starting to become more interested in these types of models and really something that accommodates the providers through strength in numbers, if you will, is really appropriate. When I say strength in numbers, I have to be careful because we still need to be very cognizant of total adherence to antitrust. And yet, when legally formed, these larger groups can have the wherewithal to negotiate on a single tax ID structure, and that's very important. So MSOs, BSOs can really help move the provider side, if you will, over to much more of a, I guess you'd say, toe to toe and more fairer, in my view, way to negotiate rates and really then have the infrastructure, which is really what we're talking about here. To answer your question, Mark, on a bigger picture, is just the infrastructure that you can create with enough critical mass of providers to support the cost of it to then be able to accomplish a lot more in virtually every area that a small group cannot accomplish. And yet, depending on that structure of operations, you can allow a lot of those small groups to remain and retain a certain amount of their independence and autonomy to run their business day to day. And so they get a little bit of the best of both worlds as such, the smallness that they like and patients like to some extent retained day to day, but the larger entity where they can accomplish some of these other things that we've noted as well. So it really makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good kind of summation of or a breakdown. When you think about that infrastructure and all the things that you guys mentioned could be entailed in that at a basic level, rev cycle, personnel, compliance, particularly in a world of growing regulatory requirements, and then the accounting and things like that. I mean, that's the nuts and bolts that allow or support what the clinical side of a group ultimately is doing or has to do. But there's a lot of efficiency to be gained, at least potentially, if done correctly and effectively and in a compliant manner, all those things. Then it sounds like there's a lot of opportunity in terms of value that can be gained from that efficiency, both for the group by itself, as well as a partner such as an outside investor, joint venture partner, wherever it may be. So it's been very helpful to get just even a relatively high level view of what these organizations are, what they do, how they do it to a certain extent. And I'll just reiterate one more time, though, the how piece is very can get very detailed, very much in the weeds, beyond what we are able to do today. But if people are interested in what types of structures are out there, how or should some of these services and functions be developed, structured, and ultimately operated, that is all available again in a more detailed presentation that folks can certainly receive when reaching out to us. So just want to encourage folks to do that. But with that, I think that's a good high level overview. I appreciate you all talking about this here because again, I know this is something we're doing a lot more work around. We're seeing more transaction activity, more interest in the space. So I think it's something that we're going to be talking about quite a bit, and I look forward to continuing the discussion. and continuing to provide information out there to our audience. So thank you guys, and we'll look forward to continuing the discussion in the very near future.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate the time.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them, and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback. And we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.